Richard Roose was not a criminal by profession. He wasn't a thief. He wasn't a rebel. He wasn't a murderer, at least not in the traditional sense. He was a cook. And in 1531, he became the only man in England's recorded history to be legally boiled alive as punishment. The crime: poisoning porridge. This is not folklore. This is not some medieval myth. It's a real moment in England's darkest legal history, signed, sealed, and sanctioned by none other than King Henry VIII. Roose was a humble household cook who had previously worked for a nobleman named Fisher, no relation to the bishop involved. In early March of 1531, Richard Roose was reportedly employed at Lambeth Palace, the London residence of Bishop John Fisher, a high-profile figure in Henry VIII's court. The story goes like this. One morning, Roose was preparing a batch of porridge in the bishop's kitchen. Several staff members, including servants and guests, consumed the meal. Almost immediately, they fell violently ill. 2 of them died in agony. Many more suffered prolonged sickness. Word spread like fire. Someone had poisoned the bishop's porridge. And though Bishop Fisher himself survived, having not eaten the dish, the incident shook the court, not just because it was murder, but because it was treasonous. It was seen as an attack on the clergy, an assault on divine order itself. Richard Roose was quickly apprehended and brought before authorities. His defense? He claimed it was a prank, a jest. He called it. According to Roose, he had added a laxative to the pot as a joke. He never intended to kill anyone, but it didn't matter. This was 1531, and England was already on edge. King Henry VIII was in the middle of a storm of religious and political turmoil. His marriage to Catherine of Aragon was collapsing. His efforts to divorce her had created a showdown with the Pope. Parliament was split. The people were tense. So when someone poisoned a bishop's food, the king didn't see a joke. He saw war, and he responded not with a trial, but with a new law. Within days of Roose's arrest, Henry VIII pushed through legislation known as the Act for Poisoning. It declared that poisoning would henceforth be considered high treason, punishable not by hanging, not by beheading, but by being boiled alive. Let that sink in. They rewrote the law just to execute one man. Roose was never granted a full trial. No jury, no cross-examination, no defense. The King's Council declared him guilty, and the punishment was set, boiling. He was taken to Smithfield, the same public square where heretics were often burned. But this was different. Burning had, by then, become a known method of execution. People understood its horror. Boiling was something else. On the morning of execution, a large cauldron was set up in the square, filled with water, herbs, and oil. It was not meant to kill instantly. It was meant to cook, slowly, publicly, painfully. Roose was brought forth in shackles. He was reportedly calm, even resigned. The crowd gathered, confused and morbidly curious. No one had ever seen this punishment carried out before. And then the boiling began. He was lowered feet first into the bubbling liquid. Witnesses say he screamed as the heat climbed his legs and blisters began to burst on his skin. When he passed out, they lifted him back out to wake him up, then lowered him again. This cycle repeated, in and out, until his skin peeled, until the muscles beneath began to cook, until his voice vanished into steam, until, at last, he was dead. It took nearly 2 hours. The crowd was stunned. Some wept, others vomited. But the message was clear. This is what happens to traitors. This is what happens when you offend. The king, even with a joke, especially with a joke, the law remained on the books for years. Afterward, boiling became a legal punishment, used in a handful of cases, but none ever again with such public spectacle. Roose's execution stood alone in its spectacle, its cruelty, and its political weight. Because make no mistake, this wasn't just punishment, it was performance. It was designed to send fear rippling through kitchens, courts, and churches. Henry VIII didn't just want Roose dead. He wanted everyone watching to never forget what happens when you undermine the order of the realm. Roose's story would be forgotten in most textbooks, but the image of a man being cooked alive by order of the crown has haunted historians for centuries. Because boiling wasn't meant for justice, it was meant for terror, and Richard Roose became its first and most terrifying victim. After Roose's body was removed from the cauldron, the crowd slowly dispersed. No cheers, no riot, just silence, a kind of stunned horror. What they had witnessed wasn't just a death. It was a deliberate, methodical destruction of a man's body in real time, by law. The pot was emptied, the fire extinguished, but the stench burned flesh, oil, and iron lingered in the air for days. Back in court, the ruling class considered the execution a success. The message had been sent, the fear had landed, but questions began to spread quietly. In the shadows of taverns and churches, was Roose truly guilty? Had he meant to kill? Or had Henry VIII used a minor kitchen scandal to justify tyranny, pushing through the most extreme form of legal violence England had ever seen? Roose's claim had never changed. He admitted to tampering with the porridge, but he insisted it was a laxative, meant as a prank, a poor joke, not a murder plot. There were no formal witnesses called in his defense. No evidence ever proved that he used poison with intent to kill. But none of that mattered. Not in 1531, because Roose didn't just poison food. He poisoned power, and under Henry VIII's rule, that was unforgivable. The boiling of Richard Roose sent ripples through English law. It marked one of the first times in recorded history that a specific method of torture was legalized by Parliament. This wasn't execution as punishment. This was execution as performance art, state-sponsored agony, choreographed to shock a kingdom into submission. Later records suggest that the boiling punishment remained legal until 1547, shortly after Henry's death. During the time, it was used sparingly, perhaps 2 or 3 more times at most. But the horror of Roose's execution outshone all others. He became a ghost in the kitchens of the nobility. Cooks whispered his name like a curse. Every pot stirred carried the weight of paranoia. Even priests tread carefully. Because the event revealed something chilling. The king could bypass justice whenever he wanted. Richard Roose may not have been a hero. He may not have been innocent. But his death revealed a terrifying truth. The crown had teeth, and it didn't need proof to bite. His name faded over time, rarely appearing in school books or church records. But his execution never disappeared completely. Historians in later centuries would return to the event with disbelief. One 19th century scholar called it the most medieval of all Tudor punishments, made more grotesque by the fact that it was introduced in the Renaissance. Others were more blunt. They called it murder by monarchy. Today, there is no memorial to Richard Roose, no plaque in Smithfield, no grave site with a name, just a few lines in dusty records and a single, unforgettable phrase, boiled alive by royal decree. But the silence surrounding his death is exactly why it must be remembered. Because the story of Richard Roose is not just about one man. It's about what happens when fear becomes law, when punishment becomes theater, when a king believes that pain is more powerful than truth. And in 1531, the belief was written into the very heart of English justice with fire, iron, and oil. So the next time you hear about Tudor England, about royal feasts and majestic courts, remember the cook who was boiled alive, not for stealing gold, not for killing royalty, but for stirring a pot the wrong way. Richard Roose, the man who became a warning in boiling water. This is Torture's Room, where justice wasn't blind, it was blistered.